Welcome to week 4. Make sure you review your class 4 slides and read chapter 8 in your Rubin and Babby textbook on conceptualization in quantitative and qualitative inquiry. Chapter 9's reading on measurement ties this week and next week's key concepts together, though I did want to note that sometimes you will see duplicate slides from the previous week's materials, and I do this to reinforce concepts and to further demonstrate how course content is interrelated. So last week we discussed that moving a concept from an abstraction to something measurable and observable is called operationalization. But let's pedal back and talk about the specification of abstract concepts, also known as conceptualization. A concept is a mental image that symbolizes an idea, an object, an event, a behavior, a person, etc. Examples might include height, age, self-esteem, motivation, and staff burnout. Some concepts have categories or values such as age and height. Other concepts such as self-esteem, motivation, and staff burnout may be operationally defined as a variable score on a scale. The Rosenberg self-esteem scale is a common tool that researchers use to operationalize the concept of self-esteem. Qualitative and quantitative studies look at concepts in different ways. For instance, in qualitative studies, variables or concepts are typically not specified in advance, otherwise known as an inductive approach. Qualitative researchers will begin a story with an idea of pertinent themes. However, the nature of qualitative inquiry emphasizes methodological freedom so that as more pertinent themes emerge, studies are able to pivot, adjust, and refine data collection and interpretation. On the other hand, quantitative studies are deductive, starting with strong theory and hypothesis and working its way down. Last week, we also introduced research questions and hypotheses and their differences. Exploratory and descriptive studies do not test hypotheses because these types of studies do not predict a relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Explanatory and evaluative studies typically hypothesize relationships between the two variables, such as a positive, negative, or curvilinear relationship. In other words, you write a hypothesis rather than a research question if you have theoretical reasoning behind explaining a relationship between two concepts. If you're lost here, definitely consult Chapter 8 in Rubin and Babby. In addition to the variables you have already heard about, so last week we talked about independent, dependent, control variables, and extraneous variables, I'm adding mediating and moderating variables to the mix. The best way to explain this is to draw it. So, here's my drawing. So this is my left, and so you should be reading this image left to right. Okay. So a mediating variable is another variable that affects the relationship between the independent variable, so the variable that explains the outcome, and the dependent variable, which is the variable that is being explained, also known as the outcome. For example, let's say that there's a relationship between student engagement, right here, this is the IV, and academic engagement, or academic achievement, and this is the DV, whereby the more a student is engaged, the better they do, right? So we already know that that relationship exists. However, could there be a variable in between that affects this relationship? So in between, our mediating variable I've identified is teacher support. Could it be that student engagement affects teacher support, which then affects academic achievement? So is teacher support really the variable that causes an increase in academic achievement? So moderating variables is something entirely different. A moderating variable is a variable that influences the strength or direction of a relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. So notice how the arrow is coming in. So it influences the strength or direction of the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. So let's return to our previous used variables. Okay, but we're going to look at this same sheet. So if student engagement is still the IV and academic engagement is still the DV or the outcome, could teacher support change the relationship between the IV and the DV? So we've already established that the more that a student is engaged, the better that they'll do academically. However, let's say that the same engaged student isn't feeling like their teacher believes in them, or deliberately doesn't call on them in the classroom, or doesn't like them. So maybe they're low in teacher support, which is this moderating variable. Perhaps then, even though a student is really highly engaged, they have lower academic achievement, so now the relationship goes the opposite way, because of a lack of teacher support. Okay, let that sit in and digest for a little bit. Moving on to operationalizing concepts. How you choose to do this matters. Read pages 179 to 189 in your textbook on how range of variation affects defining a concept and how the use of self-report, direct observation, and examination of available records operationalize variables. This week, for your discussion board post, which is due by midnight on Thursday, September 27th, I want you to select a social work concept such as child neglect or abuse, quality of life, or social support, and specify that concept so that it can be studied in a research project. How will you measure it? Be sure to specify the indicators and the dimensions you wish to include and exclude in your conceptualization. This post should be about 200 to 500 words and is directly informed by pages 179 to 189. So please consult them. For extra credit, also due Thursday, September 27th, you can specify 2 hypotheses in which a particular concept is the independent variable and another hypothesis where that same concept is the dependent variable. Each correct hypothesis is worth 1 point. For next week, make sure you finish reading Chapter 9 or reread Chapter 9 and read Chapter 11 on sampling in your Rubin and Babby textbook. Just a reminder, the EBP Project Part 1 is due in a couple of weeks on October 4th. And that's it. See you next week.